As women, we rarely tell our stories. And as military, sometimes many of us have trouble sharing our stories because it's usually about the we, not the I. And so to be able to harness those stories and the power of those stories combined with my own experience really became the genesis of what would become the grit factor.
Have you ever thought about someone or possibly a group of people who you are grateful for, but you have not told them or told them enough? Maybe they've put their life on the line or they've gone above and beyond to protect you and keep you safe in this world. Maybe they've encouraged you to feel more valid and loved, and they just have no idea how much they have touched, moved, and inspired you in your life. I want you to think about that just for a moment because we're going to come back to that. But first, I want to share how grateful I am to you for tuning in week after week to the HIListically Speaking podcast. And if you feel the same way, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to know your support by leaving a rating and a review wherever you listen to this podcast. Maybe going to speakpipe.com/HIListically Speaking and sharing your voice because your voice matters too. And just press record. And let me know the guests that you like, the episodes that have touched, moved, and inspired you. What is making a difference in your life? And if you want to take it one step further and bump it up a notch, you can even reach out to me and think about becoming a sponsor or a patron. I leave all that info for you in the podcast notes. Okay, back to that original question. Because when I think about those people who are unaware of how much they've meant to me, my mind goes to many places. The teachers, it goes to the health professionals, it goes to the public personalities that are putting their messages out there. And then there's one group of people that have really made a difference. And I think about them day after day, the ones that really make an impact. And those are our military men and women, our service people, right? Likely because I've lived that life myself, but also because I know they are on the job 24/7. And while I talk a lot about gratitude coming from within with the Hug It Out method, this month I chose to devote to special groups of people that are making that difference, especially this week with Veterans Day coming up. I want to honor and have gratitude for our veterans. And I couldn't think of anyone better than Shannon Huffman Polson. Shannon is not only one of the first U.S. Army women Apache helicopter pilots and captains, she also faced unbelievable tragedy and says her time in service helped her turn her grief into gratitude and grit. And on this episode of HIListically Speaking, Shannon shares her journey and her transition from military life to the corporate life, what she's doing to create more grit and resilience and purpose in her everyday, as well as with those she supports, and what you can do in your everyday to share your story and face the wind by tapping into the grit factor. Shannon, it has been a long time coming. We have been trying to plan this date for quite some time. I think you were in Europe the last time we chatted.
That's exactly right, Hilary. It's great to be on with you. I'm so grateful to be connected.
You are just somebody that is so inspiring to, especially in a field in the workplace where it is so male dominated. And I don't just mean your time in the military, but I mean even in the corporate sector and how you've been able to turn that around and just really use it to inspire others in the area of purpose and leadership and resiliency. But before we go there, I want to go back and just let's talk about Shannon's life as a helicopter, somebody that was in the Apache helicopters doing the work that was predominantly male, and how you went from that to what you're doing today.
That's a great
big
question.
Unload, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and it was never a straight path, never a path that I could have planned even while I was in uniform or making the transition. I left the military in 2001. It was actually August 2001, which turned out to be a really tough time to leave because, September 11th came and all of my friends were deploying. All of the life that I knew and the value that I knew that I could offer was somewhere else that I had just left. And that was a really hard and difficult transition for sure. But I had left to go to business school and was full-time at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. And I remember that, especially that first several months after September 11th, being a really difficult time to not be serving because I had just come from this really deeply insular environment where I was so completely connected to that purpose and completely connected to the concept of contribution and contribution through that type of service. Um, I left business school to work for a medical device company. It was called Guidant Corporation, later bought by Boston Scientific. They were based in Minneapolis, but I worked for them in Seattle on their sales team and was part of that team for about a year and a half and left that in order to go to Microsoft. And that's was kind of the first real solid corporate experience outside of the field that I was able to combine those lessons in leadership that were both in and out of uniform for a very, very different sort of a culture. But as you bring up
Mhm.
in technology, the culture is still very male dominated. And I worked at Microsoft for a number of years, had the chance to lead some outstanding teams, had to turn a team over, which is one of those really hard things to do anytime you're working in a corporate environment or a nonprofit environment. The military, we don't do that, but
Mhm.
but in other environments. And then, I left the corporate world in order to write my first book, which was called North of Hope,
Mhm.
and spent some time obviously working with the material, which was really difficult. It's a family tragedy and a trip up in Alaska's Arctic. We can talk about that if you want. Another whole view into grit and resilience for sure that I hadn't anticipated. And then I realized as that book came out that, I really love business. I love making things happen. I love the leadership components. I also love this really creative component. And
Mhm.
so, how can I bring those two together and really maximize impact for other people? And that was really the beginning of a journey that has led me to where I am today, which is another story we can get into if you like. But none of it was straightforward. None of it was planned. It was really about taking the right next step in the moment.
Well, I say all the time that life is like a falling into, right? We and what is
Mm.
there's that saying that God's greatest joke is like tell him what your plan is, something along those
Oh,
lines, right?
that's
Like
right.
if you wanna
Exactly.
make God laugh, tell him your plans, right? I think that's what it is. But
Well,
like
I am pretty sure that's true.
right. So,
That's
like, was it
right.
your intention actually to go into the army?
I was ROTC at Duke University, and I had never expected to be ROTC. Grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. I was an athlete. I was a debater. I was looking at colleges, trying to get as far away from home as possible, like a lot of teenagers probably do. And college was expensive for our
Mm,
family, and so when I arrived at Duke, and not before, I looked at different ways to help to support my college expenses, and I worked at the East Campus Housing Office. I worked as a waitress, and then I went to this college fair where they had all of the ROTC tables, and I thought, my dad had mentioned it and I had just automatically dismissed it out of hand, but maybe I should try it. Maybe I should try it and then I can reject it having said that I tried it. And so I signed up for Army because it was the only one of the three forces that allowed you to be a liberal arts major. The other two required you to be an engineer. And I loved it. I loved the people that were a part of it. I loved my other cadets. I loved the cadre that were there. And it really, I think for me also became this place that was a connection to purpose
mm.
and a connection to the type of service that I had grown up valuing as a young person. And so for all of those different reasons, again, not planned, not expected, I ended up taking the oath of office upon my graduation.
Mm. And the way
Yeah.
you talk about it, you have such a positive view of your time in the
Mm.
service, whether it was
Yeah.
not a full career of 20 years or even 10 years, or even if you served one tour of 4 or 2 years, you speak about
Sure.
it like it's become such a part of who you are. And I've heard a lot of people who have
Yes.
served, whether it's been an entire career of military or just one tour, that they've
Mm.
gotten so much from those years of
Mm.
determination and teamwork and learning. And is that where the grit factor comes from?
It is. I mean, it is and it isn't. It is in part because it was a way to start to put structure around the concept of grit that
Mm,
I had grown up with. Very much something that was part of my father's and mother's Midwestern roots, right?
mhm,
And something that they brought us up with in the context of sports and music and academics
mhm,
and all of the different things that we did as children. And so that word grit was something that I was familiar with from my childhood. And when I had a young lieutenant several years after I had left the military, I'd finished business school. I'd actually already worked and left the corporate world. I had a young lieutenant reach out to me through an online mentorship program and ask if I would mentor her as she began that same journey that I had done those many years before, starting out at what used to be Fort Rucker, Alabama, and flight school and becoming an aviation officer, a leader, and a pilot. And I said, of course I would. And then I suddenly doubted myself. I was like, it's been a number of years since I've served. It's things probably have changed. I was in this integration of women into this all male combat field, which was a very unique experience. And my experience is unique to who I am.
Mhm.
And so, how can I scale what I offer to this young leader? And if I do that work, which will be substantial, how can I scale the people to whom it was offered?
Mm.
And that began a number of years of interviewing leaders in the vanguards of their fields who ultimately happened to be women and happened to be military. There are general officers from across the services and a combat rescue swimmer from the Coast Guard and one of the first women Army Rangers and many, many more. And 201, they shared their stories and their lessons learned with such candor and generosity. And, as women, we rarely tell our stories. And as military,
Mhm.
sometimes many of us have trouble sharing our stories because it's usually about the we, not the I.
Mhm.
And so to be able to harness those stories and the power of those stories combined with my own experience really became the genesis of what would become the grit factor.
And when you talk about the grit factor, this is really not just a book. This is
Right.
really you're creating an entire institute under this umbrella of the grit factor, from the grit triad and the grit institute, which is focusing on purpose. And that seems to be a big part of what you're doing now, is the focus on purpose, especially. And
Yeah.
I think this is really something I learned from my time in the military and just working with the
Mm,
military now, is that when you get out of the service, are they really
yes.
preparing you for life after? Or and this happens with, we're seeing
Yeah.
a lot of that even post pandemic, people changing, pivoting. We're hearing the word, what am I doing next in my
Right.
life? So how big is purpose a
Yes.
part of the grit factor?
Oh my gosh, it's so big. So the grit factor, the grit factor really breaks out into what I call now the grit triad.
Mhm.
It's in three different sections in the book, and the grit triad, of course, by virtue of being a triad, is three parts as well. So we have commit, learn, and launch,
Mm.
and that's really aligned with owning your past, and that's owning your story and connecting to purpose. That's the foundation of grit and resilience, and we're going to come right back to that in just a moment. But that foundation is utterly critical interior work that every single one of us has to do. It's not something the military helps you to prepare for
Mhm.
as you make a transition to something very different. And many companies, most companies, don't do that work for you either. You've got to do that work for yourself. And I am now working with companies who we're bringing executive education in to help with onboarding
Mhm.
and to help with veteran transitions both. So this helps everybody, not just veterans, but certainly veterans or anybody making a major transition. That foundation has to be solid. That second part of the grit triad is the learn piece, and that is about deep engagement in the present. That's building our team, and that's taking care of our team as a
Mhm.
leader, and that's honing the art and the science of active listening, which turns out, to my surprise, to be one of the most critical leadership skills, comes out of every conversation with a general officer. And then we get into the mindset of grit and resilience. And that's a really big piece we can blow out as well. And then finally, we have the launch phase, which is grounded in the past, deeply engaged in the present, and looking towards the future with adaptability, with authenticity, and with audacity. And that audacity is that willingness to face the unknown. It's the willingness to fail. It's the willingness to try and have to get up after you fall. And those are really hard things to do. We don't like things to be uncertain, but in the last few years, whether you're transitioning from the military to a civilian career
Mhm.
or really whoever you are, we've all had to deal with uncertainty, and that's just not something that we do as humans particularly well. So that's where that audacity part of the grit factor really comes into play.
Two things that I absolutely
Yeah.
adore about you. First of all, you love alliteration because you got your triple A's,
Yes,
which I have as
of
well. I've
course.
got my triple A's with my
Yeah.
program as well, which is why it's just like we are so
Yes.
aligned. And second, it's just the talking about the mindset is such an important part of things. I think it's really
Mm,
understanding that. I mean, first of all, working in mental health as I do, the idea that the brain
yes.
does not like uncertainty. The amygdala is going to go to the negative before it goes to anywhere else. It's up to us to bring it
Yes,
back. So I love that you are creating this format and
exactly.
this program that's reminding people that we have to do our own work. We have to find our
Yes,
own
yes,
way to change the brain per se, right? Whatever tools you're using, whatever
100%.
tactics. That's great.
No, that's 100% right. And the programs that we run through the Grit Institute, and there are two right now, and they are available for both corporate
Mhm.
programming as well as occasional individual cohorts as well. But we also have just developed this for high schoolers and
Ah,
college age, so kind of pre-corporate groups, which is developed very specifically for that age group. But each one of these is really one of them is called Going for Grit, that
mhm,
follows the grit factor almost exactly. The second one is called Paths to Purpose.
mhm,
And this is because that foundational interior work is so important. And I realized when I got out of the military, and even after I'd written The Grit Factor, I was like, well, why did purpose not work for me to keep me in the military,
mhm.
right? I had a connection to purpose. And I realized that as you get older, once you're kind of out of that early and mid 20s, purpose starts to get a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced. And so in Paths to Purpose, we really look at purpose through four different lenses before coming around to say, how do we now activate that in our lives and in our careers? And both of those are just so critically important. And both of them are undergirded by mindset as well, to your point.
Yeah, really great. And I love that you're putting this
Yeah.
in with the kids too. I mean, kids need social
Mm,
emotional learning tools. They need to know that they can be well-rounded
yes.
adults. And I think there is so much room for that SEL and development so that they feel empowered.
Yes.
It's not us empowering them, it's them finding their own empowerment. And
Oh my gosh,
right, yeah.
that agency is
Yeah.
critical, right? And that is something that a lot of education is not doing right now is helping kids to understand or frankly adults to
Yeah.
understand our agency in solving problems. And you and I just talked briefly a little bit before this podcast, but the most recent Atlantic article that just
Mhm.
came out by Jill Philippovic is called The Resilience Gap. And when she looks at what the solutions are to this resilience gap, it points directly to this work that we do at the Grid Institute. But one of those things is agency, right?
Mhm.
It's hope for the future, and agency that we can actually impact the future. And both of those pieces are critical for any of us to move forward past
And
challenges.
you're also a mom too. So let's take this
Yes.
back to that. Like how much is this being shared with your own children, how they're being brought up?
Yeah, I mean, it's all 100% just part of who I am, right? I'm sort of a fan of Seth Godin's idea that there is no such thing as work-life balance. It's really integration. It's really just who we are. And part of the reason that this work resonates so much with me, and part of the reason that we developed this other program for school districts to implement as
Mhm,
well, is because I can see in my own children both the challenges and the opportunities. And as you know, this is an ongoing challenge
mhm.
with any group of people and any cohort of people, to include my own family. So life is constantly changing, circumstances are changing, we're all changing as people, and that requires adaptability in how it is that we bring these concepts to bear. But at the same time, the concepts are universal and they do work.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it's very much part of our family conversations as well.
Love that. Just so for those of you who are just like, what are we talking about here? We are talking about the grit
Yeah,
factor with Shannon Huffman Polson.
that's right.
And I am just so elated to have you here. She is the first woman to fly an Apache helicopter in the US Army and the leading line units on 3 continents. I don't even know what that means, except I know that you're pretty awesome. But I mean, to think, I mean, we see that's a real, I'm going to go back to saying this. When we think of that, when we think of the Apache
Mm,
helicopters back in the day, when we think, even now, we think of
sure.
the guys we think
Yes.
frontline, we think of the men. Not that we shouldn't,
Yeah.
but how is it to be a woman knowing that you have that kind of leadership and ownership
Mm.
of that title in a way?
Yeah, and I don't know that I'm the first. I think I'm somewhere in the first
One of
10.
the first.
So,
Did I say
yeah,
first?
one of the
One of the
first.
first is
Yeah,
still pretty
yeah.
good.
Well, right, and I always want to qualify that because somewhere out there is that woman, and I'd love to meet her. But I was the first one in the 18th Airborne
Okay.
Corps, and so that was at least a large unit where they had not yet. yet had women integrate into the combat arms part of aviation. And aviation is considered to be a combat arms in the Army,
Mhm.
but the combat part of aviation is a very small piece of it. So when I was a young lieutenant, I left Fort Rucker newly trained and qualified in the Apache, and I drove up to North Carolina to Fort Bragg, now called, I believe, Fort Liberty,
Mhm.
and arrived at 23 years old. And I was the only woman out of 120 male combat pilots. I had grown up believing that I could do anything that I wanted to do. Again, I was an athlete. I was a head of the debate team. When you go to flight school, though, you go to college and flight school, those are all academic environments where you don't really have a sense of what those challenges are going to
Mhm.
entail, because an academic environment usually is going to hopefully teach you that anybody is there that can succeed, and as long as you check the boxes and do your work and hopefully exceed the standards.
Mhm.
And then once you get to the lived reality, that can often change and be a little bit different, or sometimes a lot different. So I had the opportunity to work with some of the absolute best people I have ever known in my life, and some of the worst. And that's the bell curve that you get in any very large organization, and particularly the military. But I find in retrospect, and I wasn't even aware of it in the moment. I mean, I was aware of certainly certain components of them celebrating that, hey, this is the first woman to fire a gunnery, right, at Fort Bragg in an Apache, or pieces like that. But I don't know that I understood how important it was to tell my story so that other people could both live and tell their
Mhm.
stories until much later. And I was aware going into the grit factor too. I was just thinking, gosh, there's all the people in urban areas that hate the military that are going to hate this, and then there's all these people in the military that are going to say, who do you think you are telling your story? So everyone's going to hate this. But it turns out that it resonates to tell your
Mhm.
story, because other people do need to hear that, and other people do need to know that it's okay to tell their stories. And that's how we all learn and grow and support each other. And so that's been a real learning for me, and a real honor for me as well.
The way you share that is inspiring in itself, and there
Mm,
might be a young woman out there, a young girl that is looking at a life, not even in the military, just life in general, where they want to
sure.
take leadership, where they want to just
Yeah.
amplify their voice. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why this podcast exists, and I know that you are out there on the stage as well, just sharing your
Yes.
story, because it could touch, move, and inspire one person. If and it's one person, that's one person more than it was before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So continue to tell your story. But before there was the grit
Yeah.
factor, let's go back to what we did share a little earlier, which was about North of Hope. That was your first book,
Sure.
A Daughter's Arctic Journey. And
Yes.
was that, tell me about that. I don't know too much about that. So I want to leave that open to you, please.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the story of North of Hope occurred after my time in the
Mm.
military, but the book came out before. And in a way, I think it was harder for me to write about the military, which I know is going to be sound very strange to you in just a moment when I talk to you about North of Hope. But North of Hope is a much more personal book. So
Mhm.
the Grit Factor tells my story, but it tells many stories, and we really put frameworks around leadership, right? Leadership, grit, and resilience.
Mhm.
North of Hope is a memoir, so
Mhm.
this is a much more personal story, and the way that I tell the story is much more personal, and it follows a journey that I never wanted to take, and an experience that I never wanted to have, and that was when I was first starting out at Microsoft. I'd been there for about 6 months, and I was visiting my brother in Portland, Oregon, over a weekend, and my phone buzzed in my purse, and I silenced it, and we walked through the market and enjoyed a sunny morning, and I got back to my car to drive north again to Seattle, where I was living, and checked my phone messages, and I had a text message that ended with the three numbers 911, and it started with 907, which is the area code for the state of Alaska, which is where I grew up and where my father and stepmother were still living. And I knew that they were on a trip in the Arctic, and they were kayaking the Hula Hula River. And I knew that something must have happened, and I would need to coordinate with doctors or something. So I called the number as I was sitting in the front seat of my car, and the police answered and said this was North Slope Borough. And I said, this is Shannon Huffman. And the voice on the other end of the line said, are you Richard and Catherine Huffman's daughter? And I said that I was. And then they said words that I would never forget. They said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but a bear came into their campsite last night and they were both killed." And in that moment, everything around me completely ceased to move, to exist. It was as though I was wrapped in some kind of gauze or bubble wrap, and then things started to pick up, and everything in my life and my world had changed. And the year after that call, I took the same journey that they had taken. I flew up to the Arctic and rafted the Hula Hula River with my stepbrother and another friend of his. And we visited all of the areas that were marked on their maps and visited the spot where they died and were able to finish their trip. And so North of Hope is the story of those two trips
Mm.
and the year in between. And everything that came with it. So, very much a story of grit and resilience, much more personal, but one that I also felt was important to tell.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is not something I knew about you because I've been focusing
Mhm.
on the grit factor and who you are going
Yeah,
forward, but so much a part of us is where we came from and the stories that we bring into the
absolutely.
present. And I know this isn't the book that you're promoting now. It's not the book you're talking
Sure.
about, but it is in a way because it's so much a part of who you are. So I imagine
Yes.
that will touch, move, and inspire many people. And it's good to see the resilience and you're living your grit factor yourself, you know?
Ye
Yeah.
And in many ways, the grit factor, that military experience probably in some ways prepared me for that experience that was going to follow that
Mm.
again, never would have wanted, never wanted to have. So it is interesting, right? How if you go back and look at your story, and that's what I encourage people to do in chapter 1 of the grit factor. If you go back and look at your story, we have this opportunity and responsibility to take this raw material of our lives, some of which we haven't asked for, some
Mhm.
of which we never would have wanted, some of which we think we earned, right? Or we think we're owed in some way. Regardless of where that material comes from, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to shape it in a way that allows us to best contribute to the world. And I think that's that work of chapter 1 that is followed immediately by the work of purpose
Mhm.
that lets us build that foundation of grit and resilience.
One thing I want to share with folks who are listening to this episode is that Shannon is graciously sharing her Grit Manifesto. This is an
Yes.
unbelievable opportunity for you to really connect with Shannon and what she's teaching within the Grit Factor and everything that you've built as far as the story in your life and how you're going forward to help others in the resiliency, the leadership, the purpose. Can you share what the manifesto actually is so people know what they are getting?
Absolutely. I hope every one of your listeners will download this. It's absolutely free. It's only one page. And what it was an opportunity to both with words and using some word art graphically represent some of the key themes and ideas and inspiring, not quotes so much, but as kind of concepts that really emerge in the grit factor
Mhm.
in a more organic and more artistic way. So please do download it, post it up behind your desk, and send me a note and let me know how it inspires you in your day to
And
day.
we will definitely put that in the listen notes so people can download it and get in touch with you. We'll have all that information available. And listen, if you are touch moved and inspired by this episode, pass it along, share it with somebody else, leave a message, go to speakpipe.com/holistically speaking and use your voice to share what you enjoyed about this episode with Shannon Huffman Polson and also any of what Shannon is sharing here on the show because it really is quite a deep conversation. You opened up a lot. Do you talk a lot about the North of Hope much?
I initially gave my first keynote based on the power of narrative
Mm,
and to shape our experiences and to shape our contributions in those experiences. And that was 10 years ago. And I did use North of Hope in that context. I haven't recently, I haven't really in the past 7 years. I'm happy to.
mhm,
It's a very different kind of a conversation.
mhm.
But and a different type of a presentation, but it absolutely can be integrated. And so one of the most important things is whenever I work with clients, whether we're talking about bringing in going for grit or paths to purpose to their organization or bringing me into keynote, is that we always have several calls in advance, and we understand what their needs are, what they want to get out of that. And that helps me really shape and craft that to their needs and to their audience. So it's something I'm happy to talk about. I've usually, because a keynote is so focused,
Mhm.
we often tend to keep with the military theme. But it's an important story as well. And many of us have undergone or will certainly undergo enough difficulties in our lives that I think it's one that informs that too.
Absolutely. It's exactly what
Yeah,
this whole podcast is about. It's the traumas to triumphs, right? So, what would be your biggest
exactly.
takeaway from that part of your life?
Mhm.
What's the biggest takeaway?
From North of Hope?
Mhm.
I think that, and I don't know that I speak to this as specifically when I talk again in chapter one
Mhm.
of the Grit Factor. And, at the end of each chapter in the Grit Factor, there are some leading questions to help you do the work for yourself
Mhm.
and in your own life and work. So I just want to pull that out for your listeners because that's a really important aspect that helps you really integrate it. But the reason I bring that up is because I think as I think about the story of North of Hope and that part of my life and experience, what I understood in the writing of that book was that lesson that we have that opportunity and responsibility to take all of the pieces of our lives and decide how we're going to shape that
Mm.
going forward. And that was, again, nothing that I wanted, nothing that I asked for. It was in many ways my worst nightmare. I was very close to my father.
Yeah.
And so once something like that happens, you have a choice to let that sink you and let that absolutely destroy you, or you have a chance to say, how can I take that and move forward and do better as a result of it? How can I transform that
Mhm.
into something that has power and beauty, not just in my own life, but in the way that I'm able to contribute and share in others and do my own work in the world?
Mm.
So I think that was a really helpful prompt for me to know that I had to do that work for myself. I talk a lot about facing the wind.
Mhm.
Like, how do we take off in the Apache? How do we face into challenge? How do we face into hardship? Well, we turn our nose to face the wind. And I knew when my dad died, I knew in the wake of this really horrific accident, the only way through was to turn directly towards it and to move directly
Mm.
through it. And that is another lesson that I teach in every keynote.
Mm.
So both of those were informed very much by doing the work in the wake of that accident.
So, moving forward from that to where you are today, what's the biggest
Yeah.
lesson thus far since
Mm.
the grit factor has been
Ah.
part of your life?
Yeah, thank you. Well, certainly, so the Grit Triad has become this really important framework
Mhm.
that is informing so much of the work that I do and so much of the success of my clients. And I take that in when I teach at the Leadership and Strategic Impact course at the Tuck School at Dartmouth. I take that into companies and organizations, whether we're working with onboarding, whether we're working with cultural transformation, whether we're working with challenges within a culture, veteran transitions, any of that.
Mhm.
That triad has become really a part of all of the work that I do. But I would say the place that I'm really going deep and have been going deep the last couple of years in particular, and all of the research is really supporting this, is that second chapter of the Grit Factor is really going into purpose and
Mhm.
connecting to purpose, why that's important, how that's important. And I've realized even since the Grit Factor came out, and this is the reason for developing Paths to Purpose, is that we really can vastly expand our understanding of purpose, our work to connect to purpose, and then how we deploy that power in the work that we do in the world to really be able to leave the world a better place, to be able to contribute our absolute best. And if there's anything that the news is telling us right now, it's that the world needs all of us to contribute our absolute best. So I'm very excited about the work and purpose
Oh,
right now.
love it. Love everything you're sharing. And before I let you go, I like doing a little game with my podcast guests. So, and we're
Okay.
going to do a little word association game. I call it a rapid fire. I've been taking notes on some of the words that you've shared. I'm going to throw out a
Yeah.
word, and you're going to toss back one word at me that you identify with.
Okay.
Ready? Are
I'm ready.
you sure?
I'm not sure
No,
actually,
you're
but we'll
sure.
go. We'll do it. We'll do it.
There's
I'm
so much
sure.
training. Okay. Leadership.
Uh, I'm going right to grit.
Great. Purpose.
Opportunity.
Hope.
Agency.
Army.
Service.
Doubt.
Fear.
Commit.
Necessary.
Learn. You know
Lifelong.
where I'm going here. Launch.
Launch, yes, launch. I'll just say take off. Yes, that's great.
Story.
Crafting.
Agency.
Execution.
And grit.
Resilience.
Love it. Great. That was awesome. So I would, first of all, loved having you. I'm so glad we were finally able to make time to get together. I know we both have super busy schedules as busy women in the world of
Absolutely.
change, right? But I
Absolutely.
definitely want to give you a moment to leave some final words with the listeners, the viewers of Holistically Speaking. What would you like to leave with them?
I recently had a conversation just in the last couple of days with a couple of people who are doing work around change and transformation in an industry that is considered to potentially be fading,
Mm.
potentially even failing more rapidly. And I don't think that it is. By the way, I think they're doing the good work, and things are going to come through, but it will take time.
Mhm.
And one of the most important pieces, as I was listening to them, was hearing from them that they really wanted to honor the voices that were fearful and were doubtful and were expressing reservations and were somewhat resigned. And while I'm a big fan of honoring those voices and listening, right? Active listening is actually gets its whole chapter in the grit factor. It's a really important thing. One of the things that I told them, and this is what I would tell every one of your listeners as well, who is going through a hard time, who is in the midst of transformation, in the midst of change that seems really difficult, is that you absolutely must believe in the end. You must believe that you will succeed.
Mm.
And the Stockdale paradox is something that I refer to all the time. But of course, he was a Navy pilot in Vietnam, captured, held in the Hanoi Hilton for 7.5 years. And when they
Mm.
asked him, "How did you survive?" he said, "You must never, ever lose faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end, balanced with the brutal realities of what you face in the present." So it's not being a Pollyanna. It's not saying that there aren't incredible challenges, but you must have the energy in that hope and in that belief in order to drive forward. And if you're a leader, it's the same thing. And perhaps, well, not even perhaps, it's absolutely magnified. You must believe in and convey your belief in and your vision in that success. And there's just more energy and opportunity in that than you could ever believe. So don't lose hope. Keep that in front of you. Continue to convey that to the people that work with and for you. And that's really the essence of the first piece of leadership.
Yeah, you're a pretty awesome leader. Just by sitting here listening to you, it must be amazing to sit in the room with you or know that that somebody has been able to take something away from you. And I know I say this probably every podcast episode, Shannon, but this show for me, especially being in broadcast for 30 years now, and then transferring over to this world of emotional well-being and mental health, is that every person I have on this show is like a masterclass to me. So thank you for being a teacher. Thank you for giving me something to walk away with and feel empowered. And I know it's going to touch, move, and inspire others. I can't say it enough. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you for the good work you're doing in this world, too.
You can grab your copy of the Grit Factor Manifesto and get in touch with Shannon just by visiting the links on the podcast page. This manifesto is like the cliff notes to Shannon's Grit Factor, and it is available to you whenever you need. So definitely go to the podcast page and click the download so you have it anytime, anywhere. And if you need additional support on how to be kind to your mind, how to turn those traumas into triumphs, I've got you. So consider joining the Hug It Out Collective Thrive Hive, a wonderful and supportive community that I put together and includes other trauma-informed practitioners like myself and everyday people who want to not only live holistically, but live fully. And I shared that link as well. And if you love this episode, if it resonates with you, pay it forward. Share it with a veteran. Share it with a family member. Share it with a friend. Just share it and pay it forward. The more gratitude we get out there in the world, the more that comes back to us. HIListically Speaking is grateful for the editing done by Two Market Media, the music by Lipbone Redding, and of course, the ears and the eyes that are supported by you. So thank you. Face the wind, my friend, and always remember to hug it out and be kind to your mind. I love you, and I will see you next week.